New legislation could decriminalize sex work here in New York State. Advocates say it could help those involved stay safe. We're going to hear from an expert on the impacts the legislation could have. Hi everybody and welcome to Empire State Weekly. I'm Ryan Peterson here in Albany. Legislation in the works at the Capitol aims to decriminalize prostitution among consenting adults, also known as sex work. While the Stop Violence in the Sex Trades Act will not make this type of work legal, it will decriminalize the practice and clear prior criminal convictions for sex work-related offenses. Advocates maintain that by doing so, it'll help those involved come forward when involved in an incident of coercion or violence. Opponents of the bill argue normalizing sex work risks normalizing the abusers. All right, and joining us now to give some additional insight on the impacts the Stop Violence in Sex Trades Act may have is Renee Hank. She's the anti-trafficking coordinator of SAFE Inc., based out of Schenectady, which among other outreach also assists those who have been impacted by sex trafficking. Renee, thanks so much for giving us some time.
Thank you for having me.
So let's talk about this act. A little bit controversial for a lot of people. This is the third time it's actually come through here, right, in the state legislature. Aims to decriminalize sex work, better phrase for prostitution, for people around the state. How exactly is this going to work, and what, in your eyes, are the benefits of it?
Absolutely. So yes, it is very controversial, and I think anytime we're discussing sex work, I find in my day-to-day it's not a topic people particularly enjoy talking about. Often there is a lot of conflicting opinions about it.
Sure, but it's a big issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think what we have to remember is it doesn't matter what your opinions on sex work are, what this act is primarily about is protecting people in the workplace, and that's what we want to focus on here. So essentially what we're seeing is that New York State currently holds several legislations that discuss sex work, and about half of those legislations that criminalize sex work are discussing sex work between consenting adults, right? And so what this act aims to do is to decriminalize sex work between consenting adults. What's really important to keep in mind is that, at least for our field, is that this is not going to change any regulations regarding trafficking victims. It's not going to in any way legalize trafficking or anything like that. So that's what our focus is here. But also, as far as sex work goes, this is going to ultimately reduce violence against sex workers. Well,
that's just it. And a lot of people say it will help people come forward when there is violence or coercion. And one of the things in the law, it amends it so that roommates, say, of sex workers cannot be prosecuted simply because a sex worker lives with them. So I think that would really kind of open things up for people, that if they see something really bad that's happening, to come forward and report it, correct?
Yes, that's definitely correct. I think it creates an additional layer of safety for sex workers because they would now be able to maybe pair up, work with each other, have an extra person looking out for them. If that roommate was around, that roommate couldn't get in trouble, as you said, for being in that same area. So they can have that additional person who's keeping an eye out for them, maybe who they're location sharing with, who they are telling what's going on. And they also just have this ability now to come forward to law enforcement if there is some violence against them without being prosecuted themselves.
And from what I understand, the ACLU has actually done a lot of research on this and finds that decriminalization would do a lot of good.
Yes, yep. So the ACLU's official stance is that decriminalization would be a way to protect sex workers while actually reducing trafficking, and I am prone to agree with that. In our field, in the anti-trafficking fields, I would say most advocates lean towards a decriminalization stance in order to best protect sex workers and trafficking victims, as opposed to a legalization stance. So,
now we've heard from those who stand in opposition to this. They think it's going to do just the opposite. That by decriminalizing it, it may actually make things easier for abusers to get away with what they're doing.
Oh, yes. I've definitely heard that one before. And I think that you have to keep in mind right now, as sex work, when sex work is criminalized, it makes it very difficult to talk about. It makes it difficult for sex workers to come forward if there is violence against them, because then they can face consequences. They can be arrested for simply participating in sex work. Now, this idea that it's going to increase abuse probably comes from the idea that there's going to be an increased amount of sex work. But I think if we do see those numbers going up, if we see higher instance rates or instances of violence against sex workers, it's not because the amount of violence is going up, it's because they are being reported more readily. So we're really just creating that opportunity to open up and be honest about what's going on. And then further, I would say we've seen decriminalization in the US before. Rhode Island, I believe 2003 to 2009 or so, they had a state of decriminalization of sex work. And what they saw was a decreased amount of rape against sex workers. They saw a decreased amount of STIs among sex workers because they were able to more readily access resources. Sure. So we've seen this in the US, and we've seen that it actually does work. It reduces that violence, it reduces the risk factors of sex work, and that stance that it's going to increase abuse, I think those people often think we can just get rid of sex work, and the reality is this industry is not going away. So our best bet is to protect the people within that industry.
Real quick, Renee, given your current position and aside from this law, how big a problem is sex trafficking? I think a lot of people hear about that and they don't think that it's happening here, but it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that really comes from the way that we as a society view sex trafficking. I think often when we talk about sex trafficking in media, we have this idea that it's the sensationalized version. You've seen probably the movie Taken.
Sure.
We kind of look at that as trafficking.
Right.
But the reality is that sex trafficking is any type of commercial sex work involving force, fraud, or coercion. Or then when it comes to minors, any type of commercial sex work. Any type of commercial sex work for minors is trafficking.
Right.
So once we understand that definition, we understand that maybe trafficking isn't that being thrown in a van and kidnapped. You know, it's not necessarily that. It's just sex work that's not completely consensual. And so in the capital region, I would definitely say sex trafficking is a very large issue. And we don't have those specific numbers, unfortunately, because our data is a gross underestimate. People don't come forward, they don't report it, and in large part because they're afraid they're going to get in trouble for sex work. So even sex trafficking, which they are currently protected, is often mistaken for consensual sex work, and so people are afraid of reporting. So we don't have those specific numbers, but I would say it's a lot more common than you think. It's happening everywhere. It doesn't have to be a big city. It doesn't have to be, I think New York City people tend to think it happens in a lot, but Albany, Schenectady, we see a lot of it, and we also see sex trafficking in those small towns in the area as well. So it is happening, it is real, and it's important that people understand it in order to prevent it. Yeah.
Sure. Renee Hank, Safety Inc., based out of Schenectady, thanks so much for coming in and talking with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, yes.
Well, a change in overtime pay could put farmers in a hard spot. That's according to some of the Farm Bureau. When we return, we'll hear from the Labor Board on how the state is looking to support farmers now that that new overtime threshold has been approved. And remember, if you've got a comment or story idea, please let us know. You can email Empire State Weekly at Gmail or find us on Twitter. Welcome back to Empire State Weekly. I'm Ryan Peterson here in Albany. After a lengthy back and forth, the decision to change the overtime threshold for farm workers has been made. Current threshold for overtime pay is 60 hours. A phased-in gradual reduction will see the threshold reduced to 40 hours by the year 2032. We recently caught up with the New York Farm Bureau, who says while the change to overtime will be an additional challenge to doing business here in New York.
The longer phase-in definitely helps farmers, but New York already is one of the hardest states in the country to do business in, especially when it comes to labor costs. And so this will not help that at all. There is a tax credit that farmers can access to help pay for those overtime costs. But at this point, it's going to be very tough for farmers to compete with our neighbors just to the south in Pennsylvania.
Joining us now is Roberta Reardon, the Commissioner of the New York State Department of Labor, to give us some additional insight on the new overtime threshold when it comes to farm workers. Commissioner Reardon, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for asking.
So let's talk about this. This has been something that's been a little controversial for some time. The state has now officially put into place this plan that will ultimately reduce that threshold for overtime over the next decade or so. Why don't I get you to explain it right off the top for us here?
Sure. So we had a farm workers wage board. It was 3 members, and they met actually for several years. We had 14 public meetings. We took a lot of public commentary. And the recommendation from the board was to reduce the threshold from 60 hours to 40 hours over a 10-year period. So the way it works is the first phase in actually began January 1st, 2020. That was 60 hours. 56 hours will go into effect on January 1st, 2024. 52 hours in 2026. This is all January 1st. 48 hours in 2028. 44 hours on 2030, and then it concludes for 40 hours on or after January 1st of 2032. It is a long phase in, and thinking was that we wanted to ensure that farms had the ability to adjust as the increases came. We're very aware of the farm economy and how important it is to New York State, and in fact, to the entire country. And we didn't want to do anything that would throw their cycles off. But at the same time, we really understood, and the wage board was very clear about this, that these are workers who have waited a very long time to be treated the way all other workers in private industry are in New York State. They were the last group of employees not to have regular overtime. So that is the schedule, and it will be concluded in 2032.
And if we can be real honest for a minute here, Commissioner, these are jobs that there aren't a lot of people here in the United States that do or want to do. We're talking about people that are coming into this country and trying to, create a life for themselves, for their family. And for a long time, for lack of a better term, we're really kind of getting the short end of the stick here. So can you understand, though, too, where the farmers are coming from in a very difficult economy for them, and having to pay these employees more, even though they may understand that they deserve it, but it's going to be very difficult for them as well?
And I do. And it's interesting. This is the kind of conversation that usually happens around a wage board. I was not commissioner when the fast food wage board did their recommendation for fast food workers in New York State to make $15 an hour. But evidently the conversation with the franchise owners were, we're going to go out of business. We're not going to stay. We're going to leave the state. And in fact, the year after that increase went into effect, McDonald's opened more franchises in the state of New York. And it's not uncommon. I mean, I get it. I'm an employer. I have fixed costs. There are things I don't control in my market. And now I'm being told I have to pay my employees more. And it feels overwhelming.
Right.
But, all industries have been able to expand and handle these kinds of increases. Remember, these men and women who do this work, by and large, live in or near the communities where they work on the farms. It used to be 30 years ago that migrant workers could go back and forth across the border. That doesn't happen anymore. They're here. So they may be working in the Hudson Valley on a farm, but their family's living there too. So the money that they get when they are paid their overtime goes back into the local economy. It's the same way with any wage increase for low wage workers. They don't squirrel it away at the Cayman Islands. They put it back into the economy because they need to. And the same thing will happen with these workers.
And there are some incentives, from what I understand, that have been kind of worked in here for the farmers, some tax incentives to take advantage of to kind of ease whatever burden they may have on them, correct?
Yes, and there are a number of them. So I'm going to just quickly look at my little cheat sheet because I don't want to get it wrong. There's an increase in the investment tax credit. This credit has been around since, I think, 2014. It started at like $250. Now that investment tax credit, I'm looking at my cheat sheet and I'm getting it wrong. The investment tax credit has gone from 4% to 20%. And this is for farm businesses to be able to invest in perhaps automation that will help improve, the work for everybody. The second one is the Farm Workforce Retention Tax Credit. That's the one that's been around since 2014. It started out very low. It has now been increased to $1,200 per employee, and that's to provide relief for farmers as well. So an additional $1,200 tax credit. And then the third thing is there's a refundable tax credit for overtime hours paid by farm employers at the level established by the new regulations. So those are three ways that farmers will be able to alleviate some of the burden. The most direct one, of course, is the tax credit for overtime hours. The governor has also invested other, resources. There's a new initiative to buy New York agriculture, locally grown, locally sourced. That's going to create a much more robust market for our farmers. And of course, we at the DOL work with all of these communities to ensure that we can develop pipelines for workers who want to go into farming. I've worked very closely with Commissioner Ball at Ag and Markets. He's very concerned about the next generation of farmers. So we've had a lot of conversations about how do we entice young people to become the farmers of the future, because that's a really important part of all of this. It's actually a really exciting initiative to work on. And I understand the concerns of the farmers. I grew up in a farming community in Indiana. My uncle was a farmer in Iowa. None of this is news to me, but people go to work because they need to pay their bills, feed their families, have a decent housing, and that means that they need to be paid overtime when they work overtime.
And real quick, I want to touch on something too. You talked about that local and the initiatives too. One of the big pushes for people, especially when it comes to the public school districts, of getting those free meals, hopefully funded for all students. And one of the big pushes behind that too is to source a lot of that food, especially that fresh produce, from our local farms.
Yes, that's a great initiative. There's nothing better than fresh food for anybody, but particularly for a young person in school. We all know that food is really important for learning. You can't learn on an empty stomach, and let's make sure that they get to source that food locally from these great farms.
Department of Labor Commissioner Roberta Reardon, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It's great to meet with you.
New York has some of the strictest gun laws in the country, but gun safety advocates say more can be done. When we return, the legislation being reintroduced in the Assembly that supporters call common sense, while opponents say it's, quote, wrong-headed. Remember, if you've got a comment, story idea, we'd love to hear from you. Email EmpireStateWeekly@gmail.com or find us on Twitter. Welcome back to Empire State Weekly. I'm Ryan Peterson in Albany. Gun safety advocates recently gathered in Albany to call on lawmakers to pass a package of gun safety measures. Capitol correspondent Jamie DeLine tells us about some of the bills being discussed.
New York has some of the strictest gun laws in the country, but gun safety advocates say more can be done. Moms Demand Action would like new gun laws passed this year.
So the first thing we're doing is a very modest tax on ammunition, and that tax will be used to fund violence intervention programs.
Assemblymember Pat Fahey will be reintroducing the legislation in the Assembly. In a statement, she says, quote, "In directing revenue to New York's newly established Gun Violence Intervention Fund, we're putting resources where they're most effectively used in protecting more New Yorkers from the scourge of gun violence in the future." Minority Leader Will Barkley says while he supports gun violence prevention programs, he believes taxing ammunition will hurt legal gun owners.
We don't need to tax people more in New York. We have plenty of revenue. So I'm for supporting those programs, but through an ammunition tax, I think it's just wrong-headed.
Another bill focuses on making access to victim compensation more fair and equitable.
The last thing you need when you're suffering is to have to jump through a bunch of hoops to get support and assistance.
Assemblymember Pat Fahey's press person tells me that they're hoping to get new gun legislation passed in the state budget. Reporting in Albany, I'm Jamie DeLine.
Our thanks to Jamie. SUNY and CUNY chancellors facing lawmakers in the Capitol recently as well, pushing the legislature to accept all the SUNY investments Governor Hochul proposed in her executive budget. Those include several multi-million-dollar investments and a tuition increase for campuses and university centers. While lawmakers have some concerns about the tuition portion, SUNY Chancellor John King explains the increase may impact just a few students.
The governor has proposed a modest tuition increase across the system to try to provide that reliable revenue source. That said, 53% of our students at our campuses today don't pay tuition because of the generosity of Pell, TAP, and the Excelsior program. And that will continue to be true even with the tuition increase.
Hey, when we come back, Starbucks violating federal law, according to one judge. What the company will have to change when it comes to those looking to form labor unions. Finally, from us here on Empire State Weekly, a New York judge has ruled that Starbucks violated federal labor laws in its response to its employees who were trying to unionize out in Buffalo. Starbucks must now reinstate workers who were let go from those locations in and around Buffalo. Judge also ruling that Starbucks must also post a notice in all of its stores informing workers that they do have the right to unionize. 32 unfair labor charges were made by Workers United against the company for its actions at 21 Buffalo area stores between August 2021 and July 2022. For now, from all of us here on Empire State Weekly, I'm Ryan Peterson in Albany. We'll see you here next week. As a reminder, here's where you can see us all over New York. Here's our full schedule of Empire State Weekly on 10 television stations across the state.